Before any applause, before any chorus, before any name is chanted in the streets, there is a time that almost no one sees. A time when nothing seems to be happening, but everything is already being decided. And what was decided there helps to explain why God chooses, shapes, and sustains people in ways that almost always confuse us. Some stories begin where no one imagines that something important is happening. And almost always, these are the ones that most confuse those who try to understand God. Some stories begin in the center of power. Others are born far away, where no one is watching. David's story begins in that second place. Bethlehem was not a stage. It was not a point of reference. It was not a promise. It was merely a small dot on the map, a place where life followed the simple rhythm of the countryside. There, among discrete hills and repetitive days, a young man learned to live without knowing that he was being observed by something much greater than any human gaze. While the world valued strength, stature, and presence, God observed something else. Something that cannot be measured, something that cannot be displayed, something that only appears when no one is trying to impress. At that time, Israel already had a king. A man chosen by the people, shaped by collective expectation, sustained by the appearance of leadership. But something had broken. It wasn't immediately visible. No announcement, no sudden fall. Just a silent departure. A presence that no longer dwelt where it once remained. When God decides to act, He rarely explains everything. He moves pieces. He creates encounters. He sends words that carry more weight than they seem. That is how the prophet arrived at Jesse's house. One by one, the children passed before him. Strong bodies, confident posture, confident gazes. Everything that the human heart usually associates with leadership. Yet, something remained missing. An emptiness that cannot be resolved by appearances. God is not in a hurry. He waits until all the obvious options have passed. Only then does He ask the question that changes the course of history. Someone is still missing. What was missing wasn't a better candidate. What was missing was the one nobody remembered to call. David was in the field, tending sheep, far from expectation, far from ceremony, far from what usually defines destinies, and yet exactly where he needed to be. The training camp wasn't a setback. It was preparation. There he learned to stay. He learned to deal with silence. He learned to protect what wasn't his. He learned to respond when no one applauded. Each ordinary day formed something invisible. A loyalty without an audience. A courage that didn't need to be proven. A sensitivity that didn't seek recognition. When David was finally called, nothing about him suggested greatness. No crown, no armor, no heroic narrative, just someone who carried within him what God seeks before any mission. The oil was poured, the words were spoken, the promise was made, and then nothing changed on the outside. David returned to the field. This is one of the hardest parts to accept. The anointing didn't speed up time. The choice didn't eliminate the process. The promise didn't bring shortcuts. Something, however, had been sealed. While no one noticed, something new began to grow within him. Not a sense of superiority, not the certainty of control, but a silent awareness of belonging. God was with him. And that was enough, even when everything around him seemed the same. At the same time, elsewhere, the palace was beginning to darken. The absence of God never arrives with a noise. It settles in slowly. It brings unease. It disrupts the inner self. It creates noise where there was once direction. It was in this contrast that their paths crossed. The same David who had learned to calm the flock now calmed a king. The sound that echoed in the fields now echoed in the corridors of power. None of this was by chance. Nothing was improvised. The countryside had taught them what the palace could not. When the conflict arose, David was no longer a novice. The giant that stood before Israel was no greater than the fears he had already faced alone. The public challenge merely revealed a conviction built in secret. The stone wasn't the beginning, it was the result. What fell that day was not just one warrior. It was an entire logic based on visible strength. The victory did not come from momentary audacity, but from a long history of trust built away from the collective gaze. From then on, everything accelerated. Recognition, songs, approval. And along with that, something more dangerous, envy. Not all praise opens doors. Some even lead to persecution. David would learn that being chosen doesn't mean being spared. On the contrary, sometimes it means being tested in deeper ways. The same hand that anointed him didn't immediately remove him from the conflict. The same God who chose him allowed him to be pressured, and yet something remained intact. David was not in a hurry. He did not take what had not been given to him. He did not force the fulfillment of the promise. He understood something that few understand. What God establishes in his perfect timing does not need to be taken by force. Even when he had the opportunity, he did not overstep boundaries. He knew that authority is not built by violating principles. It is sustained by respecting what God had already established, even when it came at a high price. This is the heart of the story. Before becoming king, David learned to wait. Before leading a people, he learned to obey in anonymity. Before governing, he learned to trust. What God saw in that field was not perfection, it was direction. It wasn't the absence of flaws, it was a willingness to turn to him whenever one fell. That's why this story doesn't begin with a throne. It begins with a heart, and everything that comes after is born from here. There's a period that almost never gets attention. It doesn't appear in celebrations. It's not remembered in victories. It's rarely mentioned when someone tells a story after everything has gone right. Yet it's in this period that almost everything happens. David had been anointed. The words had been spoken. The gesture had been made before witnesses. Something real had been established. And yet, the following days carried no visible sign of change. The field remained the same. The sheep continued to demand care. The heavens had not opened. No new door had appeared. This gap between what God promises and what he accomplishes is often disconcerting. Human expectation anticipates immediate action. God, however, works at a different pace. He does not rush what still needs to mature. David returns to the field not as someone forgotten, but as someone being preserved. The silence of that place now carries a different weight. Each repeated day deepens something that cannot yet be seen. The anointing does not transform him into a king, it anchors him in identity. Before any external authority, he learns to deal with what happens within. Meanwhile, in another scenario, something falls apart. Saul's reign begins to lose internal coherence. The absence of God doesn't manifest itself in immediate collapses. It expresses itself in restlessness, impulsiveness, and loss of discernment. Power remains present, but clarity begins to falter. It is in this contrast that the paths converge. David doesn't arrive at the palace as a threat. He arrives as a relief. The music born in the countryside traverses the corridors of power. The sound that learned to exist without an audience now finds restless ears. What seemed like mere talent reveals itself as an instrument of care. The same God who had initiated something in secret begins to position it in environments that demand emotional maturity. None of this is forced. Nothing is taken by force. Doors open without fanfare. David observes more than he speaks. He learns more than he teaches. He is near the throne without touching it, close to power without desiring it. This kind of proximity is formative. It shows what power does to people. It reveals weaknesses that the field does not expose. When the conflict finally emerges, it doesn't arise suddenly. It had been brewing in invisibility. The giant that rises before Israel represents more than an external threat. It exposes collective fear, paralysis, and a lack of confidence. An entire army, trained, armed, and experienced, yet incapable of advancing. David arrives without fully understanding the logic of the paralysis. His eyes have not yet been shaped by the politics of fear. He listens to the challenge and reacts with bewilderment. The question that arises within him is born not from audacity, but from conviction. Something is misaligned. Something is out of place. The courage displayed there was not improvised. It was honed in ordinary days, in repeated decisions, in small responsibilities. Lions and bears were not merely physical obstacles. They were experiences that taught David to act without visible guarantees. The confidence built there now finds a larger stage. The confrontation is swift, almost disconcerting. The logic of visible strength crumbles before a confidence that transcends mere proportion. What defines the outcome is not technical skill, but inner clarity. David knows whom he trusts. This guides his movements, his words, his posture. Victory, however, does not end the tension. It inaugurates it. Public recognition brings something new to David's life. He becomes visible, praised, compared. What was once invisible now attracts attention, and attention is not always a blessing. Sometimes it awakens what was latent in other hearts. Saul begins to look at things differently. Admiration gives way to insecurity. The applause surrounding David doesn't strengthen him, it exposes him. From this point on, the atmosphere changes. The same palace that sheltered him begins to feel unstable. The sound that once calmed him now provokes tension. David realizes that something has changed, but he doesn't react hastily. He doesn't respond to the threat with direct confrontation. He doesn't try to accelerate what God hasn't yet accomplished. He remains faithful to the duties entrusted to him, even when the context becomes hostile. This is one of the quietest aspects of his development. Loyalty doesn't depend on a favorable environment. It endures even when human logic would suggest self-preservation. David learns to live under pressure without allowing that pressure to redefine who he is. Time passes. Opportunities arise. Some seem definitive. Others seem unfair. Still, he doesn't cross boundaries. He doesn't confuse promise with permission. He understands that there are things that can only be received, never taken. Meanwhile, something solidifies. The character that began in the field is now tested in complex environments. The obedience that seemed simple becomes costly. Remaining upright begins to demand real sacrifice. This period between the promise and its fulfillment is not wasted. It is the process itself. It is there that faith ceases to be a concept and becomes daily practice. It is there that identity is strengthened without depending on immediate results. David is not yet king. The throne has not yet arrived. The promise has not yet been fulfilled. But something essential is already taking shape, something that will sustain everything that comes after. The waiting time is not empty. He is very prepared. And that's what makes him decisive. There comes a point when waiting ceases to be silent and becomes uncomfortable. Not because the promise has disappeared, but because remaining faithful begins to have a real cost. It is when integrity stops being an admirable virtue and becomes a risk. For David, this moment came without warning. It settled in gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, a different look, a prolonged silence, a presence that once welcomed and now assessed. The surrounding environment no longer responded in the same way. Saul didn't lose the throne immediately. He lost something harder to perceive: inner security. The instability growing within him needed a target, and David unintentionally became that point of tension. The young man who had been called to bring relief began to cause unrest. The sound that once calmed now exposed what was out of balance. When someone lives close to God, that closeness inevitably reveals what is in conflict in other hearts. David doesn't understand everything immediately. He doesn't interpret the change as an outright threat. He continues serving. He continues fulfilling his duties. He remains faithful to what has been entrusted to him. There is a healthy naivete in this behavior, a trust that has not yet been tainted by the logic of self-preservation, but the pressure is mounting. The environment begins to become unpredictable. Security disappears. What was once a learning space transforms into unstable terrain. The proximity of power reveals something the field didn't teach. Not all authority handles well what it doesn't control. When danger becomes clear, David doesn't react with rebellion. He reacts with discernment. There's an important difference between perceiving the risk and responding harshly. He chooses the more difficult path, preserving respect even when he isn't protected. This period marks a profound transition. David ceases to be merely someone in training and becomes someone who has been tested. What was once simple trust now needs to coexist with constant vigilance. Life becomes less predictable. The nights are no longer peaceful. Still, something stands out. David does not become bitter. The persecution doesn't turn him into someone obsessed with self-righteousness. He doesn't allow the injustice he suffers to define his limits. Even when threatened, he doesn't rewrite his principles to survive. This silent choice shapes something lasting. The bond with Jonathan arises in this context, not as a political strategy, but as mutual recognition, a friendship born from a clear perception of character. Jonathan sees in David something that goes beyond skill or popularity. He recognizes the hand of God where others see only risk. This friendship doesn't eliminate the danger. It merely reminds David that he is not alone. There are times when God doesn't remove the conflict, but offers companions who help to get through it. The persecution intensifies. The intentions are no longer veiled. The risk becomes concrete. The palace is no longer a safe place. David needs to leave, not as a defeated man, but as someone who understands that there are battles that cannot be won by remaining where integrity is constantly threatened. Escaping is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of discernment. This period of separation marks a new kind of learning. David leaves behind structure, relative comfort, predictability. He enters a time of displacement, a time when nothing is fixed, a time when each day demands heightened attention. Even so, he doesn't allow himself to act driven by resentment. When opportunities arise to turn the tables, he steps back, not out of fear, but out of clarity. There are limits he doesn't cross, even when he could. He understands that taking on something outside of the right time frame would cost more than waiting. The prolonged persecution reveals who he truly is. Far from applause, distant from institutional protection, David becomes a leader of broken, weary, displaced people who also haven't found their place. And in this unlikely group, he learns to lead with empathy, not with imposition. This period doesn't appear in victory songs. It's not celebrated in triumphant narratives, yet it is there that David's heart deepens. It is there that his dependence on God ceases to be mere talk and becomes a daily necessity. The time of persecution does not erase the promise, it tests it. David doesn't know how long this will last. He doesn't know when everything will change. He doesn't know if there will be a quick return or a long wait. What he does know is simple. He doesn't need to become someone else to survive. And this silent choice sustains everything. The field shaped him, the palace exposed him, the persecution refined him. None of this was wasted. What is being built now is not just a future king. This person is capable of bearing the weight of what will come next, and that requires more than just strength. It demands loyalty when no one is guaranteeing any security. There is a type of learning that doesn't happen while everything is in its place. It emerges when stability disappears and life ceases to offer clear references, when there is no fixed address, predictable routine, or sense of control. It is in this unstable territory that David begins to live. Exile doesn't begin as a choice. It imposes itself as a necessity. To remain would mean compromising what David had decided to preserve from the beginning: integrity. Leaving wasn't a cowardly escape. It was an acknowledgement of limits. There were environments that no longer allowed loyalty without excessive cost. Upon leaving the palace, David enters a time of constant uncertainty. Each day demands careful consideration of the context. Every decision carries immediate consequences. There is no room for distraction. The silence of the countryside gives way to the noise of survival. Even so, something stands out. David does not abandon consulting God. The instability does not push him toward impulsive decisions. On the contrary, he begins to discern more carefully. The dependence intensifies. What was once trust cultivated in anonymity now transforms into a daily necessity. The group that forms around him reflects this period. People who are indebted, tired, frustrated, and displaced. They are not elite warriors. They carry no prestige. They are men marked by losses and broken expectations. And yet, they find in David a leadership that does not oppress. David doesn't lead through fear. He leads through presence, through the ability to remain lucid amidst pressure, through the refusal to exploit the weaknesses of others to strengthen himself. This attitude creates something rare: genuine loyalty. Exile doesn't remove the risk, it only changes its form. Now, danger comes from both outside and within. Poorly judged decisions can cost lives. Mistakes cease to be abstract. They become concrete. David learns to bear real responsibility. Even in enemy territory, he doesn't lose sight of who he is. He adapts without dissolving. He learns to read different contexts without abandoning his values. This ability prepares him for something greater than mere survival. It prepares him to govern very different people. There are times when everything could be resolved quickly. The shortest path appears. The opportunity arises. Saul is vulnerable. The threat could end there. Many around him see this as a divine response. David sees things differently. He understands that ending the conflict through the wrong means would compromise everything that has been built up to that point. He doesn't measure decisions solely by the immediate result. He considers the kind of person he would become by crossing certain lines. This discernment doesn't stem from fear. It stems from inner clarity. David doesn't need to rush what God has already promised. He doesn't need to take by force what has been announced as a gift. There is a silent maturity in this choice. Time passes. The persecution doesn't cease. The wait lengthens. The promise seems distant. Yet David doesn't disconnect from God. He writes, he sings, he prays, he laments, he trusts. His spirituality ceases to be circumstantial and becomes structural. It is during this period that many words gain depth. They are not rehearsed phrases. They are expressions born from pressure. A cry for help, surrender, sustained hope when logic would suggest giving up. The relationship with God becomes more honest, less idealized. Exile doesn't harden him, it deepens him. When injustices occur around him, David feels their weight. When mistakes are made, he learns to take responsibility. When people fail, he doesn't distance himself. He learns to deal with human complexity without losing his way. This period teaches something essential. Leadership doesn't begin when power arrives. It begins when someone learns to care for people in fragile environments without any guarantee of success. Nothing in this time is wasted. Each journey broadens your perception. Each risk sharpens your listening skills. Each wait strengthens something that cannot be produced in comfortable contexts. David doesn't know when the exile will end. He doesn't know how. He doesn't know in what way the promise will be fulfilled. He only knows that he needs to remain faithful to what he has already understood, and that's enough. The time spent on the move doesn't define him as a fugitive. It shapes him into someone capable of sustaining future stability. Those who learn to remain steadfast when everything is in flux don't get lost when the throne finally arrives. Exile was not a setback. It was a deeper exploration. And when that time begins to draw to a close, David is no longer just someone chosen. He is someone who is prepared. The end of the wait rarely arrives in the way we imagine. When it finally does, it almost never brings immediate relief. Instead, it reveals new layers of responsibility, new pressures, and questions that didn't exist before. For David, the end of the chase didn't mean the end of the burden. It only changed its form. Saul's death brings a long and painful cycle to a close. The man who pursued him, who tried to kill him repeatedly, who turned his life into constant displacement, is no longer there. It would be easy to celebrate. It would be understandable to feel relief. Yet that is not David's response. He doesn't react with triumph. He reacts with lament. This detail reveals something fundamental. David never saw Saul merely as a personal obstacle. He saw in him an established authority, a king who had failed, but who still held a position that could not be treated with contempt. David's mourning is not theatrical. It is sincere. He honors what God had established, even when it cost him years of pain. This moment exposes a profound difference between ambition and vocation. Those driven by ambition celebrate the downfall of others. Those guided by vocation understand that collective losses are never a cause for personal joy. David's heart remains aligned even when the scenario finally changes in his favor. The promise begins to unfold, but in a fragmented way. David does not become king of all Israel at once. First, he governs only Judah. 7 years pass in this intermediate state. He is no longer a fugitive, but he is not yet a fully fledged king either. He is caught between what has passed and what is yet to come. This in-between is uncomfortable. There is enough recognition to generate expectation, but not enough stability to generate rest. David needs to lead knowing that the kingdom is divided, that there is resistance, that there are fragile alliances, that not everyone trusts him. The promise advances slowly, almost as if testing his ability to uphold what he has asked for. During this period, David does not force unification. He does not manipulate alliances. He does not accelerate processes for political convenience. He governs where he has been placed and waits for the rest to organize themselves in due time. This stance avoids artificial consolidation, but it demands patience. The division between the tribes is not merely political. It reveals internal wounds, ancient loyalties, accumulated fears, distrust of change. David needs to learn to lead without total control, without absolute dominance, without guarantees. This learning is essential. Whoever governs without learning to deal with resistance becomes a tyrant when their power expands. Time passes, and the balance begins to shift. The house of Saul weakens. The leadership that attempts to maintain the division loses consistency. Gradually, the tribes recognize what had already become evident. David was already acting as a leader even before fully occupying the throne. When the kingdom finally unifies, there is no spectacle. There is consensus. A recognition built over time, not imposed by force. David becomes king of all Israel because he had already been leading steadily, even without the full title. This detail changes everything. Upon assuming control of the unified kingdom, David made a strategic and symbolic decision. Jerusalem became the capital, not merely for convenience, but for wisdom. The city did not directly belong to any dominant tribe. Making it the capital avoided favoritism and created a common point of national identity. More than just politics, this choice reveals vision. David doesn't govern solely for the present. He thinks about what sustains unity in the long term. But governing doesn't eliminate conflict. On the contrary, it makes it more complex. Now David needs to deal with external threats, internal disputes, and above all, his own heart. Power doesn't automatically corrupt, but it exposes, it amplifies. It tests intentions. David consults God before acting. He doesn't treat victories as guaranteed. He doesn't assume that past success ensures the next step. Every decision becomes an exercise in conscious dependence. This habit wasn't born on the throne. It was formed in exile. The military victories that follow are not merely demonstrations of strength. They reinforce something deeper. David understands that he does not rule alone. He recognizes limits. He recognizes the source of the authority he wields. This keeps him vigilant, even as he expands his power. At the heart of the kingdom, something still needs to be realigned. God's presence does not occupy the central place in national life. David perceives this, and he acts. He doesn't just govern territories, he is concerned with spiritual direction. This sensitivity sets him apart from leaders who confuse success with divine approval. Bringing the ark to Jerusalem becomes a priority. Not out of empty tradition, but out of a deep understanding of what sustains the people. The first attempt fails. The mistake is costly. David's reaction is not defensive. He stops, he learns, he corrects. This moment is crucial. The king acknowledges that enthusiasm does not replace obedience, that good intentions do not negate responsibility, that God does not adapt to human haste. This correction preserves something essential: humility amidst power. When the ark finally arrives, the celebration is unrestrained. David gets completely involved. He doesn't hide behind his title. He rejoices. He exposes himself. He stands before God without masks. Not everyone understands. Some despise this attitude. David accepts the scorn. This is another sign of maturity. He no longer governs to please expectations. He governs from conviction. The approval that matters does not come from public image, but from a conscience aligned with God. The kingdom is now established. The promise has been fulfilled. Yet the story is far from over, because reaching the promised land is only the beginning of an even more demanding phase. The wait is over. The process continues. The throne does not end the calling. It just makes it more visible. And David continues on, not as someone who has won every battle, but as someone who has learned not to lose his way when he finally arrives where he has waited for so long. There is a type of test that only appears after everything seems to be in place. It doesn't come with persecution, scarcity, or visible threats. It emerges when stability settles in, when battles diminish, when the name is already respected and the future seems assured. It is a silent test, and often more dangerous than any external opposition. David reaches this point. The kingdom is consolidated. Jerusalem is the capital. The borders are protected. The ark is at the center of national life. The people recognize its leadership. Everything that was once a promise is now part of daily life. And it is precisely in this environment that something begins to shift from within. Scripture makes a point of recording a disturbing detail. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. It's not an explicit accusation. It's an observation, a subtle shift in position. It's not about cowardice, but about absence. The king who once walked with his people now remains in the comfort of the palace while others face the battlefield. History doesn't point out the mistake immediately. It lets the reader perceive it. Because great falls almost never begin with scandalous decisions. They begin with small concessions, an altered pace, relaxed vigilance, a sense of entitlement that settles in without asking permission. David doesn't plan what happens next. He simply doesn't interrupt. The gaze lingers where it shouldn't. Desire finds space. Authority offers easy paths. In a short time, what could have been avoided transforms into something that demands control, silence, and strategy. David's sin does not stem from ignorance. It stems from the distance between who he was in secret and who he begins to allow himself to be in the center of power. He does not lose faith. He loses his sense of limits. The most serious issue is not the initial act, but the chain of events that follows, the attempt to manage consequences instead of facing the truth, the use of one's position to protect one's image, the substitution of transparency for calculation. When sin is left unaddressed, it craves protection, and protecting a mistake becomes increasingly costly. David, who refused to touch the Lord's anointed when he was being persecuted, now touches the life of a faithful man to preserve his own reputation. The irony is harsh. The contrast is intentional. Scripture does not soften the blow. It exposes. Uriah possesses an integrity that further illuminates the king's failing. He refuses to enjoy comfort while his companions are at war. He honors what David, at that moment, failed to honor. Uriah's faithfulness makes the king's choice even more weighty. When death occurs, silence seems to work. For a while, the palace continues. The routine goes on. The kingdom doesn't immediately crumble. This delay is deceptive. It gives the impression that everything has been resolved. It wasn't. God sends a word, not a direct accusation, but a story, a mirror, an invitation to conscience. David reacts with moral indignation at the injustice recounted, and then he hears the words that break down any defense. That man is you. There is no escape possible there. David could have justified it. He could have relativized it. He could have cited his history of victories. He could have reminded everyone of everything he did for Israel. He does none of that. He takes responsibility, simple, without embellishment, without negotiation. I have sinned against the Lord. This phrase doesn't erase the consequences, but it restores something essential, the center of the heart. David doesn't try to negotiate forgiveness. He acknowledges the breach. He puts himself back in his rightful place. The authority he almost used to shield himself now bows down. Forgiveness comes. The consequences remain. This coexistence is uncomfortable but profoundly true. Grace doesn't eliminate the effects of wrong choices. It prevents those effects from defining the end of the story. The pain that follows is real, personal, familial, structural. The environment that once seemed stable now becomes fragile. Conflicts arise within the home itself. The sword enters where there was once safety. The prophetic word is fulfilled not as arbitrary punishment, but as an inevitable result. David goes through this period without abandoning God. He suffers, prays, is silent, cries, and gets up. At no point does he shift responsibility. He doesn't blame circumstances. He doesn't hide behind his position. He lives with the weight of what he has done. And something profound happens in this process. The man who has fallen does not lose the ability to return. He is not redefined by the mistake. He is redefined by the response to the mistake. The difference between David and other kings lies not in the absence of flaws, but in his willingness to allow God to work on his heart without resistance. He does not harden his heart. He does not shift blame. He does not abandon the relationship. The throne does not protect him from brokenness. He kneels like someone who knows that everything he possesses can be lost if his heart turns away again. This chapter in David's story is unsettling because it dismantles idealizations. He is not a linear hero. He is a real man before a holy God. And this tension is what makes his story relevant. Abundance revealed what scarcity did not. Power exposed areas that persecution did not touch. And yet, the thread that sustained David did not break. Because when everything crumbles, what was built in secret still endures. The story doesn't end here, but she changes her tone. From that point on, David ruled knowing that the greatest battle was not outside, but within. Vigilance is never optional. Intimacy with God does not replace ongoing obedience. And a heart after God's own heart is not a flawless heart. It's a heart that never fails to return. There are pains that come from the outside, and there are pains that are born from within. The former tend to unite, the latter disrupt. They don't arrive as declared enemies, but as silent cracks in what should be a refuge. For David, this was the most difficult territory to cross. After the fall, the kingdom remained standing. The political structures remained. The throne was not removed, but the house began to fragment, and no crown protects a father when grief engulfs his own children. The biblical text does not attempt to soften this phase. It narrates it with almost cruel sobriety, because there are times when faithfulness to God does not prevent one from reaping what has been sown. Grace sustains, but reality follows its course. The first blow comes from where David least expected it. Violence invades the intimacy of the family. A son deeply wounds his own sister. The silence that follows is heavy. There is no immediate record of firm action. There is no swift justice. The king who judged the people's cases now finds himself paralyzed within his own house. This silence comes at a price. The absence of a clear answer allows the wound to fester. Resentment grows. Untreated pain transforms into patient hatred. Another son observes, waits, plans, time passes, but nothing is resolved. When vengeance finally explodes, it brings no relief. It only amplifies the tragedy. One son kills another. Blood now marks the royal lineage. The house that should reflect order now mirrors the chaos that was once only outside the palace walls. David loses more than just children. He loses moral authority within his own home. Not because he ceased to be king, but because his past choices undermined the power of his words. Leadership, when wounded at its core, suffers silent erosion. The son who runs away is not a stranger. He is someone who shares the same blood, the same surname, the same history. The escape transforms into exile. Exile into emotional distance. Distance into something even more dangerous. Idealization. While David remains in Jerusalem, his son builds an alternative image. He draws closer to the people. He listens to their complaints. He offers empathy. He promises justice, not by force, but with a calculated presence. The heart of the nation begins to shift. When rebellion manifests itself, it doesn't emerge as a direct attack. It presents itself as a solution, as an alternative. As an improved continuity. This type of threat is more difficult to confront because it feeds on real flaws. The news arrives. The impact is devastating. The king must flee his own capital. The path is now reversed. Before, David fled from Saul out of loyalty. Now he flees as a consequence. The difference weighs heavily on every step. The ascent of the hill is marked by tears. There is no military strategy at that moment. There is mourning. There is shame. There is silent pleading. The man who danced before the ark now walks barefoot, covered in dust, exposed to ridicule. Even so, something remains intact. When insulted, David doesn't react. He doesn't silence the offender. He doesn't order revenge. He accepts the humiliation as part of the process, not out of weakness, but out of understanding. He knows that that moment isn't about restoring his image, but about overcoming what needs to be overcome. The rebellion is gaining momentum. Confrontation is inevitable. David organizes what remains. He gives clear instructions. And amidst the tension, he makes a request that reveals what still governs his heart. spare my son." This plea doesn't stem from naivete. It comes from wounded love, from a father who understands that the loss has already been too great. Even in the face of betrayal, he doesn't dehumanize his son. He doesn't turn him into a common enemy. The battle unfolds far from his sight. The outcome arrives without emotional preparation. The son dies not as a hero, not as a victor. He dies suspended between heaven and earth, trapped by his own pride. The news doesn't bring strategic relief, it brings collapse. David does not celebrate the preservation of the kingdom. He mourns the loss of his son. His lament is raw, repetitive, desperate. There is no discourse, there is no elaborate theology, there is only exposed pain. This moment reveals something that runs throughout David's story. Even when he makes grave mistakes, he never stops loving deeply. The heart that led to his downfall also keeps him human. Leadership needs to be regained. The people wait. The army watches. David recovers, not because the pain has passed, but because the responsibility remains. He learns something hard. Governing requires continuing, even when the heart is in ruins. This chapter of David's life offers no easy answers. It doesn't end with immediate restoration. It leaves scars. It shows that some wounds don't disappear. They simply become integrated into history. Even so, God does not abandon us. The promise remains standing, even through ashes. The covenant is not broken. The future still exists. Not because David was flawless, but because God is faithful to what he has established. After that point, David governs with a different awareness, less impulsive, more conscious of the limits, more attentive to the invisible cracks. He learned that the greatest risk lies not in external opposition, but in internal negligence. Justice delayed exacts a high price. Leadership that fails to listen creates wounded heirs. And perhaps the hardest part of all, some pains cannot be avoided, only endured with God's help. There comes a point in life when strength still exists, but it no longer governs everything. The body responds more slowly, memory carries more weight. The past ceases to be just a memory and becomes a constant presence. It is at this point that David enters the picture. He is still king, he still governs, he still decides. But something has changed. Not dramatically, nor visibly to everyone. It has changed internally. Time is beginning to assert itself not as an enemy, but as a limit. The years of war are behind them. The great expansions have ceased. The kingdom is established. Jerusalem is a political and spiritual center. The ark remains. The promise is alive, and yet David feels the weariness of one who has carried too much for too long. Leadership now demands a different kind of strength. Not the strength of the arm, but the strength of vigilance. Not the strength of conquest, but the strength of maintenance. And this kind of responsibility is silent, constant, and exhausting. It is during this period that tensions arise that do not come from outside, but from within the power structure itself. People who are close to the throne begin to vie for space. Succession ceases to be a distant idea and becomes a disguised urgency. When a king ages, the throne becomes noisier. David understands this, but doesn't react hastily. He has learned throughout his life that decisions made to silence anxiety often create bigger problems later. Still, time doesn't wait for eternal uncertainty. Meanwhile, he does something that reveals his final maturity. He begins to prepare for what he will not see completed. The temple he wished to build will not be erected by his own hands. This ancient refusal still echoes, not as punishment, but as a boundary. And David agrees. Accepting limitations may have been one of the hardest battles for someone who spent their entire life moving forward. He no longer questions things as he once did. He doesn't insist. He redirects. If he can't build, he prepares. If he can't lead the work, he sustains the vision. He organizes resources. He structures shifts. He orders tasks. He thinks about the spiritual future of the people beyond his own existence. There is something profoundly humble about that. Working for something that another will complete requires true selflessness. At the same time, old mistakes still echo. The house remains fragile. Relationships cannot be repaired by decree. Some absences remain. Some names will never again be spoken without pain. David carries this in silence. He also faces one last major flaw. A mistake born not of passion, but of administrative pride, the decision to count, to measure, to quantify, as if security lay in numbers and not in God. Regret comes quickly, conscience weighs heavily. The consequences are harsh. Collective suffering exposes once again that leaders' decisions never affect only those who make them. David doesn't shy away. He takes responsibility. He chooses to fall into God's hands, not men's. This choice sums up who he became, not perfect, not immune to error, but deeply aware of where his hope lies. When the altar is raised, something comes to an end, not just a crisis, an entire cycle. The place of the fall is transformed into a place of the future. Where there was judgment, promise is born. Where there was pain, preparation arises. Time keeps moving forward. Succession finally takes hold. There is an attempt at usurpation. There is confusion. There is a real risk of rupture. David, already physically weakened, still maintains spiritual clarity. He acts with quiet firmness, not to assert himself, but to preserve what God has established. He confirms who should reign, not based on strength, charisma, or ambition, based on divine guidance. He ensures continuity without unnecessary violence. In his final moments, David doesn't speak of past glory. He speaks of future faithfulness. He guides, he warns, he points out paths. His words are not triumphal, they are conscious. He knows that the story doesn't end with him. The man who started out in the fields ends up looking beyond himself. His body weakens, but his vision remains clear. He finally understands that his greatest contribution was not winning battles, writing songs, or ruling a kingdom. It was showing that it is possible to walk with God even while navigating profound contradictions. David doesn't leave behind a flawless image. He leaves behind an honest testimony. A heart that fell, rose again, erred, repented, trusted, waited, and remained turned towards God until the end. As the final silence approaches, there is no fear. There is surrender. There is gratitude. There is rest. The story doesn't end in perfection. It ends in fidelity, and that's enough. There comes a point when life stops demanding new decisions and starts demanding meaning. Time is no longer used to build something unprecedented, but to understand what has already been built. For David, this moment arrives unannounced. It is not marked by an isolated event, but by a growing sense of closure. The body weakens. The presence becomes quieter. Others take on tasks that were once natural, and yet something remains active. Not strength, but consciousness. David looks back and doesn't see a straight line. He sees curves, detours, deep falls, unexpected victories. He sees right choices and mistakes that could never be corrected. He doesn't rewrite his own history. He owns it. This is rare. Most people try to preserve an image. David preserves a relationship. He doesn't sustain himself because of what he built, but because of who sustained him. That distinction changes everything. The legacy he leaves is not a model of perfection, but of constant return. When we speak of David, we speak of a man who experienced extremes. The courage of the battlefield, the fear of exile, the honor of the throne, the shame of sin, the joy of worship, the weight of mourning. Few have lived so much in a single life, and yet, What transcends everything is not the intensity of the experiences, but the direction of the heart. David was never the strongest, the most stable, or the most consistent. He was the most aware of his dependence. This awareness appears in the Psalms he wrote, in the decisions he postponed, in the limits he respected when he could have pushed forward. The kingdom he leaves behind is more than just expanded territory. It is a people with a renewed spiritual identity. Jerusalem is not merely a political capital, it is a center of worship. The ark is in its place. The idea of a God present among the people is alive. Even David's mistakes ultimately teach us something. They reveal that leadership without inner vigilance becomes vulnerable, that gifts do not replace character, that anointing does not eliminate responsibility. These lessons transcend generations because they are not theoretical, they are lived. When the biblical text calls him a man after God's own heart, it is not ignoring his sins. It is acknowledging something deeper, the ongoing willingness to realign himself even after falling. This kind of heart is not measured by emotional constancy, but by spiritual direction. David always returns. He always surrenders. He always acknowledges. This sets him apart from many kings who came after him. His legacy also points beyond himself. The promise he received does not end with his name. It projects the future. A kingdom that would not be sustained solely by military force or political succession, but by a loyalty that would transcend time. The lineage of David carries hope. Even when the throne seems to weaken, the promise remains. Even when kings fail, the covenant is not broken. There is something in motion that transcends immediate history. David may not have fully grasped the extent of it, but he trusted. And that trust becomes his ultimate teaching. In the end, there are no grand speeches. There are no monuments erected by himself. There are simple instructions. There is spiritual guidance. There is a man who understands that his role was to prepare the way, not to control the outcome. The approaching silence is not empty. It is full of meaning. David departs as he lived, aware of his failings, confident in God's faithfulness. He doesn't leave a closed answer for all suffering. He leaves a testimony that authorizes hope even amidst complexity. His story continues to be told because it resembles ours, not idealized, not sanitized, not predictable. A story where God works even when everything seems out of alignment. The field, the palace, when it blooms. The throne, it remains. Regret, the legacy. All of this paints an honest picture of what it means to walk with God in the real world. And perhaps that is why, after all, David is still remembered not as the perfect king, but as someone who never stopped seeking God's heart, even when his own heart was failing. The end doesn't come as an isolated event. It approaches gradually, diluted in small signs that only those who have lived a long time learn to recognize. The body responds more slowly. Decisions begin to require rest. Silence lingers between one word and another. David enters this time without surprise. He has already learned that everything that begins also ends. The kingdom continues to function. The structures are firm. Jerusalem remains the center. The ark is in its place. The people continue. Yet, something changes. The focus of the story shifts from action to memory, not a nostalgic memory, but a reflective one. David begins to revisit his own journey without the need to justify anything. He doesn't review his life like someone trying to organize successes and failures into separate columns. He revisits it like someone who understands that everything has been intertwined from the beginning. The field, the palace, the escape, the throne, the fall, the return. Nothing happened in isolation. Each stage carried the seeds of the next. Looking back, David doesn't see a predictable path. He sees choices made in imperfect contexts. Some were born of faith, others of weakness. Many were made without complete clarity. Yet there is a thread that runs through it all. He never stopped turning to God, even when he was confused about himself. This becomes more evident in the records he left behind. The words he wrote do not hide contradictions. They reveal someone who learned to speak to God from reality, not from image. Praise and lament coexist. Trust and anguish appear side by side. The exposed heart is not a literary device, it is a spiritual posture. David understands at this final point that his greatest contribution was not the size of the territory conquered, nor the military strength established. It was leading the people to understand that God is not distant, that he can be sought, invoked, questioned, and worshipped in the midst of real life. The legacy he leaves behind is not easy to imitate because it is not technical. There is no formula. There is no reproducible method. There is an inner disposition that transcends time, turning to God whenever one's own history seems to go off track. Even their mistakes continue to speak volumes. They teach that position doesn't replace vigilance, that experience doesn't immunize against falling, that intimacy with God doesn't eliminate responsibility. These lessons don't come as theory, but as visible scars in the narrative. The way David handles the end also reveals a great deal. He doesn't try to artificially extend his influence. He doesn't cling to the throne. He doesn't create unnecessary disputes. He prepares, guides, organizes, and lets go. There is maturity in knowing when to lead and when to trust. The succession takes place amidst tension, as almost everything in his life does. Even so, David acts with enough clarity to preserve what he considers essential. He doesn't merely transfer power. He imparts spiritual direction. His final advice doesn't revolve around expansion, but about faithfulness. When your words become less frequent, the silence that settles is not empty. It carries meaning. The story doesn't end in public exaltation, but in continuity. Others will follow, others will err, others will seek, and God will remain. It is at this point that the title attributed to David gains depth. A man after God's own heart never meant perfect alignment. It meant constant guidance, a heart that even when misaligned in decisive moments, never settled far from God. This is why David transcends generations, not because he offers an ideal model, but because he offers an honest mirror. His life empowers the faith of those who know they cannot sustain perfection, but desire to remain in relationship. Time erases voices, military feats, and political decisions. What remains is what was built in invisibility, the trust cultivated when no one was watching, the obedience chosen when the shortcut seemed easier, and the sincere repentance when the mistake could no longer be undone. David doesn't end his story by resolving all tensions. He ends it by remaining faithful to what he learned about God along the way, and that, according to Scripture, is enough to stand the test of time. The field where it all began still echoes. The heart that has learned to wait still speaks. The story concludes without haste, without spectacle, without easy answers. And perhaps that is precisely why she is still alive. There comes a point when a life ceases to be merely a sequence of individual experiences and begins to function as a passage. What has been lived does not end with the person themselves. It becomes a reference point. It becomes language. It becomes ground for others to tread upon. It is at this point that David's story achieves something greater than his own time. As the scriptures continue to unfold, David is no longer present as an active character, yet he does not disappear. His name continues to be mentioned. His life story continues to be used as a benchmark. His mistakes continue to be remembered. His faith continues to be evoked, not as nostalgia, but as a criterion. This is because David's life wasn't built solely on results. It was built on relationships, and everything built on relationships endures through time with more strength than that which is born only from performance. The kings who came after him were judged by David, not because he was flawless, but because he established a clear spiritual benchmark. The question that began to accompany the history of Israel ceased to be merely, was there prosperity, and became, was there faithfulness? This shift in focus originated with him. Even when the kingdom fragments, even when idolatry grows, even when injustice creeps in, the memory of David remains as a silent contrast. He becomes a possible turning point, a reminder that another stance before God once existed, even amidst profound failings. The covenant established with David does not function as a personal reward. It operates as a promise in motion, a promise that transcends generations, survives political collapses, withstands exiles, and remains alive even when all seems lost. This is only possible because it does not depend exclusively on faithful men, but on a faithful God. As time passed, expectations grew. The idea of a descendant who would carry forward what David had only begun began to occupy the people's imagination. Not just any ruler, someone who would definitively unite justice, faithfulness, and divine presence. The prophets rekindle this hope. In times of crisis, they point to it. In times of darkness, they remind us that the promise has not been forgotten. The name of David emerges not as a longing for the past, but as a sign of what is yet to come. This hope has shaped the faith of Israel for centuries. Even when kings fail, even when the nation is wounded, the promise linked to David remains like an invisible thread, sustaining the expectation of restoration. When the New Testament begins, it doesn't start in a vacuum. It begins precisely where that promise was suspended. David's name appears right at the beginning, not as a genealogical detail, but as a theological affirmation. History wasn't interrupted, it was being carried forward. David's life, with all its contradictions, comes to be understood as preparation, not as a closed model, but as an open path. He points to something greater than himself. His throne prepares the understanding of a kingdom that would not be sustained by military force, but by absolute fidelity to God. At this point, the story ceases to be merely biographical and becomes revelatory. David is not just someone who lived intensely. He becomes part of the language God uses to reveal himself to humanity. His life helps explain how God works, choosing, forming, correcting, restoring, and guiding without abandoning. What is striking is that God doesn't erase David's flaws to build this bridge. He integrates them. This reveals something essential about how God relates to human history. He doesn't demand flawless trajectories to fulfill his purposes. He demands hearts willing to remain turned towards him. David may not have fully grasped the scope of his own life. Often neither do we. Most of what we do seems small, fragmented, insufficient. Yet, when lived faithfully, it becomes part of something greater than we can see. This is what David's story silently teaches us. Lives surrendered to God rarely produce immediate and perfectly organized results. They produce continuity. They produce meaning that only reveals itself over time. The field where David tended sheep didn't seem connected to the future of the world. The palace where he erred didn't seem compatible with eternal promise. Exile didn't seem like preparation. The fall didn't seem compatible with covenant. And yet, it was all integrated. This integration is what transforms a human story into a spiritual bridge. David lived intensely, failed deeply, repented genuinely, remained sensitive to God's voice, and ended his life trusting God more than himself. This combination, imperfect in human eyes, became fruitful in God's hands. The story that began with a forgotten pastor ends by pointing to something that transcends time. Not because of the pastor himself, but because of the God who chooses to work through real stories. David's legacy is not a formula to be repeated. It is an invitation to walk with God without masks, without forced shortcuts, without escaping reality. An invitation to trust that God continues writing even when the page seems blurry. And perhaps that's what makes this story so alive even today. It doesn't demand perfection to continue. It only demands a willingness to remain in the relationship. This is how a life becomes a bridge, and that's how the story continues. There is a kind of silence that is not absence, it is transition. It arises when the major decisions have already been made, and what remains is learning to live with what has been built. There is no hurry, no expectation of anything new, only the awareness that history has entered its final phase. David has been living in this silence for the past few days. He is no longer reacting to the world. He is observing. The pace slows down. The words become more measured. Life ceases to be a sequence of confrontations and becomes a space of assimilation. This silence is uncomfortable. It brings to the surface memories that no longer need to be fought, only acknowledged. Faces that are no longer present, decisions that cannot be undone, paths that can only be accepted as part of the whole. There is something profoundly human in this moment. David doesn't try to rewrite his story in his thoughts. He doesn't fantasize about better versions of himself. He contemplates. And in this contemplation, he learns something that perhaps only time allows one to learn. Not everything needs to be resolved to make sense. The scriptures do not describe lengthy speeches during this period. There are no new psalms recorded. There are no grand public acts. What exists is the silent stillness of someone who has already understood enough to rest. The kingdom continues to function because it no longer depends exclusively on him. This is one of the greatest signs of maturity. When a leader builds something that remains standing without his constant presence, something has been done right. David sees it happening. Others make decisions. Others lead battles. Others organize the daily life of the kingdom. He observes without interfering more than necessary. There is no anxiety to control. There is trust in the process. This silence also reveals something about God. The same God who spoke clearly in decisive moments now manifests himself through continuity. There is no spectacular new revelation. There is sustenance. There is daily faithfulness. For David, that's enough. He understands that his relationship with God doesn't depend on intense experiences all the time. It is sustained by consistency, by the recognition that God remains present even when there are no extraordinary signs. This understanding didn't come early. It was built through setbacks, losses, and waits that went on for far too long. The final silence is only possible because there was deep dialogue along the way. There is also something that closes inward, the need to prove oneself, the urgency to respond, the pressure to meet others' expectations. All of this loses its power. What remains is the awareness of having walked with God in the most honest way possible. David knows his story will be told. He knows he will be remembered, but that no longer worries him. He doesn't try to shape his own public memory. He trusts that what needs to remain will remain. Silence allows history to speak for itself. There's something almost pedagogical about it. David teaches without words that the value of a life lies not only in what is said or done in its most visible moments, but in how it ends. The way someone accepts the end says a lot about how they lived the whole life. This ending is not dramatic. It is not tragic. It is not triumphant. It is human, real, integrated. The man who began invisibly ends discreetly. What changed was not the external form, but the internal meaning. The field and the throne meet at this final point. Both become part of the same story. Silence also serves as preparation for those who come after. It creates space. It doesn't occupy everything. It doesn't suffocate the future with excessive presence. It allows the next generation to assume real responsibility. This is one of the hardest legacies to leave behind. Not the control, but the space. David finally understands that God doesn't need his physical presence to continue fulfilling his promises. He needed his willingness while he was there. Now, he only needs his surrender. The final silence is not empty. It is full of trust. Trust that God will continue to be God. Confidence that the promise does not depend on a single man. The belief that the story doesn't end with one's own life. It is in this silence that mature faith finds rest. And perhaps this is where David's story becomes closest to our own. Not everyone will experience great battles or occupy visible positions, but everyone at some point will need to learn to be silent, trust, and surrender. The faith that remains when words cease is the faith that truly transcends time. David reaches the end without answers to everything, but with enough confidence to rest, and that makes the ending something serene. When David's life comes to an end, there is no attempt to organize his story into simple categories. He doesn't fit into easy labels: shepherd, warrior, fugitive, king, poet, father, sinner, repentant. All of this coexisted in the same man without negating each other. What remains is not an idealized version. It is a real journey, a life traversed by God, with all the marks that this implies. David is not remembered because he won every battle, nor because he ruled flawlessly. He is remembered because even when he failed, he did not turn away. Even when he fell, he did not shut himself off. Even when confronted, he did not harden his heart. There is something profoundly revealing in this. God doesn't build his history with flawless people. He builds it with available people, people who return, people who listen when called to the truth. David's heart was not defined by the absence of error, but by constant direction. He knew where to return. This is one of the hardest truths to accept for those who observe faith from the outside. Absolute consistency is expected, linearity is expected, continuous strength is expected. David's life dismantles this expectation. It shows that true faith overcomes contradictions without breaking. Throughout his life, David experienced moments when everything seemed to be in order. He also experienced others when everything was falling apart, both internally and externally. Even so, his relationship with God didn't depend on emotional stability or visible success. It depended on connection. This bond sustained his songs in days of joy and his cries in days of anguish. It sustained his courage in the face of enemies and his humility in the face of his own guilt. It sustained his leadership and his capacity to ask for forgiveness. David did not try to compromise his image before God. He did not offer sophisticated justifications. He presented himself as he was. This requires a rare spiritual maturity. It requires enough confidence not to hide. When God calls David a man after his own heart, he is not endorsing his wrong decisions. He is acknowledging his willingness to remain sensitive, even when confronted. He is recognizing his refusal to become indifferent. Indifference is more dangerous than error. Error can still be confessed. Indifference closes off any possibility of return. David never became indifferent. This characteristic transcends generations. Even centuries later, when Israel no longer lives under his rule, his name remains a point of reference. Kings are judged by their conduct. Promises are made based on their lineage. Messianic hopes are anchored in their history. David's legacy transcends his reign because it touches something deeper than political power. It touches on how God relates to real, fragile, and evolving human beings. The promised Messiah would not come from the lineage of a perfect king, but from a human king. This is not a detail, it is a sign, an indication that God enters human history without demanding that it be previously purified. He comes in to redeem, not to replace. David paved the way not only with territorial conquests, but with a spirituality that knew how to lament, celebrate, confess, and trust. His psalms remain alive because they speak of experiences that do not grow old. They speak of fear, guilt, hope, waiting, trust, restrained joy, deep pain. They speak of God's presence in all these layers. When David's story ends, it doesn't conclude as a rigid final point. It transforms into a foundation, a reference point, a mirror. Each person who approaches this narrative finds something of themselves there, the feeling of anonymity, the weight of waiting, the temptation to act on their own, the belated regret, the desire to start over, the need to trust when there are no guarantees. David's life teaches us that the path with God is not about constant performance, but about continuous relationship. It's not about never falling, but about never turning away permanently. In the end, what remains is not the isolated achievements, but the journey. It's not the moment of anointing, nor the victory over Goliath, nor the throne in Jerusalem. It's the invisible thread that connects it all, a heart that returns. This return was not automatic. It cost tears, it cost confrontations, it cost irreversible losses. Yet, it was possible because God did not withdraw his presence, even when he needed to correct things. This is the hope that runs through David's story and reaches those who listen today. God does not abandon the work he has begun simply because it is going through difficult times. He works throughout the process. The end of David's story doesn't call for applause. It calls for respectful silence. It calls for reflection. It calls for honesty. Because at its core, this story isn't just about an ancient king. It's about the kind of heart God continues to seek. Not a perfect heart, a heart available, a heart that knows how to return. And perhaps that's what makes this story timeless. There are stories that don't end when the last character leaves the scene. They remain open, traversing time, waiting for someone willing to listen attentively. David's story is like that. It doesn't end at the final point in the biblical text because it continues to encounter people at very different moments in their lives. Each generation reads David from the perspective of its own questions. Some approach him when they are just starting out and feel small in the face of what seems too big. Others arrive weary, carrying mistakes they no longer know how to fix. Some come seeking direction. Some come simply trying to survive their own inner turmoil. What is surprising is that history welcomes everyone. David doesn't require his listeners to be at a specific point in their journey. He speaks both to those still in the field and to those who have already tasted the weight of power. He speaks to those who wait in silence and to those who face irreversible consequences. His life creates a common language among people who would never otherwise meet. This is because Scripture does not present David as a distant, unattainable example. It presents him as someone who went through real conflicts, someone who knew the enthusiasm of the beginning and the weariness of the middle of the journey, someone who had to learn to deal with his own heart when no one else could help him. David's story resonates with listeners because it doesn't try to convince, it reveals. It reveals that the path with God is made of encounters and missed encounters, of clarity and hazy areas, of unwavering faith and broken prayers. It reveals that God remains present even when the person themselves doesn't know exactly where they are. Throughout everything that has been recounted, a subtle line remains. God does not abandon the process. He does not turn away in moments of confusion. He does not become indifferent to failures. He continues working, sometimes silently, sometimes correcting, sometimes simply sustaining. This doesn't make the story any easier. It makes it true. David never had complete control over what was happening. He lived through promises that were delayed. He lived through threats that didn't cease quickly. He lived through consequences that couldn't be undone. Even so, he continued his relationship with God, not as someone who always understands, but as someone who trusts enough to keep going. This trust is the meeting point between ancient history and those who listen today. Many people go through phases where everything seems suspended. Nothing progresses, nothing gets resolved. The silence lingers. David's story reminds us that these periods are not empty. They are formative. What is being built there is rarely visible, but it is usually essential. Others are experiencing moments where wrong choices have already produced consequences. There's no going back. David's story reminds us that true repentance doesn't erase the past, but transforms the future. It doesn't eliminate consequences, but restores the relationship. There are also those who live under constant pressure, external expectations, internal demands, the feeling that they need to always live up to expectations. David's story shows that living to please people is an unstable path. Living guided by God creates a deeper foundation, even when the cost is high. The field, the palace, the escape, the throne, the fall, the return, the silence. All of this forms a narrative that does not attempt to simplify faith. On the contrary, it respects the complexity of human life. That's why this story continues to be told. She doesn't offer quick answers. She offers companionship. She doesn't promise the absence of pain. She promises presence. She doesn't create unattainable heroes. She reveals a God who walks with real people. In the end, what remains is not an isolated lesson. It is a silent question that accompanies the listener. Where in your own story is God working now, even if nothing seems obvious? Perhaps in the place you consider too small. Perhaps in the silence you're trying to avoid. Perhaps it's a process you'd like to speed up. David's story suggests that God does not waste any of these phases. She also reminds us that the heart matters more than location. That direction is worth more than speed. That turning back to God is always possible, even after long detours. When the narrative ends, there is no applause. There is space. Space for reflection, space for identification, space for silence. And perhaps this is the final invitation. Not to imitate David, not to romanticize his story, but to recognize that the same God who accompanied him continues to be present, working on stories that are still being written, yours included. If this story resonated with you, perhaps it's because at some point it touched upon something you're also experiencing. Here at the Bible Teaches, we continue exploring the scriptures from that same place, a space for listening, maturing, and trusting, where we learn to remain while God works in silence.